Hi, it's Denise Hubble, respiratory therapist, chatting about the digestive system, also known as the gastrointestinal system. Thinking about the digestive system, the overall goal is to ingest food, break it down into its smallest particles possible so that it can be absorbed into our bloodstream, and then the blood will carry those nutrients and ATP to all of the cells for building and for metabolism of the cells. The gastrointestinal system is made up of two components. The first is the alimentary canal. This is one continuous long tube that extends from the mouth to the anus. Of course, it changes a lot along the way. For example, the stomach is a pouch of that tube, and the small intestine is a long and coiled section of that tube, but it is one continuous tube. And in that tube, we have many, many microorganisms. This is different than the rest of the body. The rest of the body would be considered a sterile environment. No microorganisms are present. So if we have a patient with a perforated bowel, which means a hole in this gastrointestinal system, or alimentary canal, then we can envision that those microorganisms are going to leak out into the peritoneal space and then actually picked up by the bloodstream potentially. This can cause infection in the blood, which is known as sepsis. So a frequent type of patient that we deal with has sepsis due to a perforated bowel. So yes, we have the two main organs, the alimentary canal, and then we have all of the accessory digestive organs. All of these accessory organs are basically assisting the alimentary canal in its job of breaking down and absorbing the nutrients and the energy from food. This is an excellent overview of the digestive system, starting with the oral cavity, the mouth. At the base of that we have the tongue. We also see salivary glands, parotid glands. They include, parotid glands, sublingual and submandibular. Then we have the pharynx, and leading to the esophagus. The esophagus opens into the stomach. The stomach opens into the small intestine, which is made up of three portions in this order: duodenum, jejunum, and then ileum. The ileum then connects to the large intestine, and that starts with the cecum, and then we move upwards in the ascending colon and across in the transverse colon, and then the descending colon, then the sigmoid colon, then the rectum, and then the anal canal, and then the anus. A few of the accessory organs are listed here. We can see that the liver is on the patient's right-hand side, and it's large, and beneath the liver we have the gallbladder. Underneath the stomach we have the pancreas, and to the patient's left of that is the spleen. Also mentioned here is the appendix, and it is located where the small and large intestine join. Anatomy of the mouth is listed here, includes things such as the hard and soft palate. And I want to mention the uvula, this soft tissue that is hanging from the soft palate at the posterior of the oral cavity. We will be looking at the uvula and studying it in some patients in order to assess the difficulty level of intubation, which is a process of placing an endotracheal tube into the patient's trachea. So believe it or not, we're actually going to be evaluating the view of the uvula in patients in order to assess the ability, or the ease of ability hopefully, for intubation. This is a great cross section of the oral cavity and the pharynx and the upper portion of the esophagus. Starting at the top of the slide, we see that the hard palate is indeed made up of some hard tissue. There's some bone in there. And posterior to that is the soft palate and then the uvula. We also see the teeth and the lips and the tongue. We notice that the tongue is very muscular. Posterior to the tongue we see the epiglottis, which is basically a tissue flap that actually folds down during swallowing. When it folds downwards during swallowing, it occludes or blocks the larynx so that food will not get into the larynx and then down to the lungs. Instead, food will be directed down the esophagus. We also see some of the tonsils listed here. This is an excellent view of the oral cavity with the mouth open. We can see the uvula dangling at the posterior of the oral cavity. I like this view because we will be doing assessments of patients before surgery called pre-op assessment that involves a Mallampati score. The Mallampati score is a scoring of our view of the uvula in patients when they have their mouth open. Depending on the Mallampati score, the patient may be easy to place a breathing tube in or difficult to place a breathing tube in. So this is termed intubation. So it correlates somewhat well. So the Mallampati score can give you a general idea of the difficulty of intubation with the patient. So that's why it's important to know where the uvula is and what it looks like. In this case, this patient has a Mallampati of 1, which is a good score. Portions of the pharynx are mentioned on this slide. There are actually 3 parts of the pharynx: nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. It's important to note that food should not be in the nasopharynx. It should only pass through the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx. The action of peristalsis is the alternating contraction of muscles around the pharynx, for example, in this case, to propel food downwards into the esophagus. Also, I want to add that there is a sphincter at the top and the bottom of the esophagus. Sphincters are muscle bands which can constrict and they can relax. The upper esophageal sphincter is termed the upper esophageal sphincter, and it's at the most superior portion of the esophagus. The lower esophageal sphincter is also called the cardioesophageal sphincter. It is between the esophagus and stomach. The esophagus is accessed when some tubes are placed, for example, oral gastric tubes or nasogastric tubes, and transesophageal echocardiography. So some of our devices we use medically are placed in the esophagus. It is a tube running from the pharynx to the stomach, and it is muscular, and it uses this action called peristalsis to move food. And once we get below the pharynx and into the esophagus, it should be food only. There's no respiration occurring in this area. This describes all of the layers of the alimentary canal, starting on the inside with the mucosa, this moist layer. It has an epithelial layer, a bit of connective tissue, and some muscle. The next layer from that is the submucosa layer. The contents are listed here. And then we have this smooth muscle layer called the muscularis externa. And then the serosa is the outermost layer, but it's actually made up of 2 layers of peritoneum, the visceral and the parietal. So the visceral would be the inside lining, and the parietal is the outside lining. And they're described here. Also in that serosa are some fluid-producing cells. This is such a great image on the right and the left. On the right, I just want to point out this is a cross-section of the anatomy, and we see there are these things called mesenteries. The mesenteries are folds of peritoneum which attach the abdominal organs to the posterior wall. So it supports and anchors these organs. Also on the left, we see the anatomy of the gastrointestinal system again, and we see some things pointed out such as the liver and the spleen and the gallbladder and the intestines. The alimentary canal is controlled by the nervous system, and predominantly the parasympathetic nervous system is what stimulates the alimentary canal. When it stimulates it, it increases mobility and secretions in the GI tract. Where the esophagus meets the stomach, there is the cardioesophageal sphincter, which is a muscle band designed to keep food down in the stomach. Some patients and some people have difficulty with the sphincter and have a lot of acid reflux up into the esophagus. If this is persistent, it's termed GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, and we know that there's a splashing up of stomach contents into the esophagus in these patients. So we have a sphincter at the top of the stomach, and then we have a fundus area at the superior portion of the stomach, and we have the body of the stomach, and then we have the pyloric area, and then at the exit of the stomach is the pyloric sphincter, which is another muscle band or valve which controls the amount of materials leaving the stomach and entering the duodenum. The duodenum is the beginning of the small intestine. When we look at the stomach, we see it C-shaped, and the outer part of the C is called the greater curvature, and the inner part of the C is termed the lesser curvature. Also, we see that there are multiple muscle layers, and I'm sure this makes sense to you, as this organ is designed to churn food, and this aids in the breaking down of the food physically. Also, we see rugae of the mucosa. This is the idea that the stomach can fold on itself when it's empty, and then it allows it to expand when it needs to hold more contents. We're introducing the lesser and greater omentum here. These do support the abdominal organs and their extensions of the peritoneum. They're made up of fat, connective tissue, and blood vessels. And one could think of them as drapes on the anterior of the abdominal organs and supportive tissue. Let's look at the structure of the stomach. So the inside lining, the epithelium, is made up of simple columnar cells. Most of these are mucus cells, and they produce a very alkaline mucus. The reason for this is because the contents of the stomach are very acidic. The pH is between 1.5 and 3.5. And if this acidic environment was allowed to be exposed to the lining of the stomach, it would cause damage to that lining. So there is a mucus lining that is a more basic pH, and it protects the cells lining the stomach. Also, if we could look at this under a microscope, we would see these indentations called gastric pits. Inside the gastric pits, there are gastric glands that secrete a lot of different stuff, which makes up gastric juice. One of the things in the gastric juice is intrinsic factor, and as it mentions here, it helps with vitamin B12 absorption. Also, there are chief cells which produce pepsinogen that helps break down proteins, and parietal cells which produce hydrochloric acid, which creates the really low pH environment of the stomach. The idea of having this acidic area in the stomach is that the stomach acts as a decontamination chamber. In case you eat a microorganism or a parasite, we hope that this acidic environment will kill those types of microorganisms. Okay, mucous neck cells, they produce acidic mucus, which is different than the mucus cells of the mucosa. And then enteroendocrine glands produce hormones such as gastrin, which is involved with your feelings of hunger and satiety or fullness. I think we know a lot of these points about the stomach. I just want to mention the term chyme, that once the food has been digested and broken down quite a bit in the stomach, it is now termed chyme. So that it is chyme that will enter the small intestine. This is an excellent image showing these pits that are lining one's stomach and all of the cells that are inside of the pits. And we've learned that these cells each excrete different products. Here is that pepsinogen has been produced, but it is not an active agent yet. It needs to be combined with hydrochloric acid in order to become pepsin. And pepsin is what we need in the stomach to aid digestion. The small intestine is the major digestive organ because this is where most nutrient absorption is occurring. It is the longest part of the alimentary canal, about 2 to 4 meters long, and has these 3 components we mentioned before, the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. If we looked at the duodenum, we would see that there are 2 ducts coming into the duodenum, dumping some enzymes and some bile. The enzymes are produced by the pancreas, and the bile is produced by the liver. These enzymes and bile assist with the digestive and absorption process that is occurring in the small intestine. The small intestine is designed to maximize surface area between the chyme and the blood vessels. The idea here is the more surface area, the more absorption of nutrients and energy from the chyme into the blood vessels. It does this in three ways. It has three layers of essentially folds. Microvilli are the smallest, also known as a brush border. They are the most microscopic and they are folds, as we'll see in the following slides. Villi are larger than microvilli. They are folds again to increase surface area. Then circular folds are larger again. So let's take a look at those in the next couple slides. Before we get there, just a shout out for Peyer's patches, which are involved with the immune system. We'll study those in the lymphatic system. They're located in the submucosa. Here we see the placement of the liver, which is the largest gland in the body, made up of 4 lobes. The gallbladder is shown in green and the pancreas is shown in yellow. The duodenum is shown in pink. So the liver produces, it does many things, but for one, it produces bile. It dumps it by way of the bile duct into the small intestine, specifically the duodenum portion of the small intestine. The pancreas creates enzymes and dumps it by way of the pancreatic duct into the small intestine. And we know that the bile and the enzymes are going to aid with digestion and absorption of food. This shows a couple of the structures we've talked about. Remember, we really want to maximize surface area in the small intestine to expose the blood vessels as much as possible to the chyme. So, on the microscopic level, we would have microvilli. They're not shown here. Then we would have villi, and then we would have the circular folds. You don't need to memorize all the terms on this slide, but this is showing the idea of the villi and how they increase surface area. And then on a microscopic level, we have microvilli, also known as brush border, on the individual cells, also increasing surface area. Here we see the portions of the large intestine. Starting at the lower left, we see that the small intestine dumps into the cecum, which is a portion of the large intestine. This area has the ileocecal valve. Also, the appendix is hanging here. It is a collection of lymphoid tissue involved with the immune system. You may have heard somebody that had appendicitis, which is inflammation of the appendix. So the cecum is a portion of the large intestine. Then we have the ascending colon, aptly named because it's going upwards. And then we have the transverse colon, the descending colon, and then the sigmoid colon is S-shaped. Then we have the rectum, the anal canal, and then the anus, which has 2 sphincters, internal and external, thank goodness. Also, I'll just point out the term haustra or haustrum, which are the puckerings of the large intestine. Looking at the anatomy of a tooth, the crown would be the exterior portion of the tooth, coated in enamel, which is the hardest substance in the body. Beneath the gums would be the root of the tooth. The salivary glands are mentioned here. We looked at their location before. They, of course, produce saliva, which helps to moisten food and create a bolus, or sort of a lump of food, basically. Also, the saliva contains amylase, which is involved with digestion. The pancreas is an amazing organ. It performs exocrine functions and endocrine functions. In the gastrointestinal system, there are exocrine functions, which means that it produces something and it exits the organ and actually, in this case, dumps it into the small intestine. The products that it produces include an alkaline fluid to neutralize the acidity of the chyme that's coming from the stomach. Otherwise, the small intestine could get damaged by this very acid chyme. Also, this fluid contains enzymes which help in digestion. But it is very interesting that the pancreas is also an endocrine organ. It produces some things such as insulin and glucagon, which are involved with the endocrine system, and it is addressed in that section. The liver has many roles, including detoxification of toxins in the body, but it also produces bile, which aids in digestion. The bile leaves the liver through the common hepatic duct and then through the bile duct, and then it reaches the duodenum. It is a yellowish green color and it helps in the breakdown of fats. Carbohydrates get broken down into glucose, which is also known as blood sugar. The glucose then gets broken down by some reactions. The first step is glycolysis, and this occurs in the cytosol. What happens is that the glucose molecule is split into 2 pyruvic acids and some ATP. The next step occurs inside the mitochondria. And this is the citric acid cycle, also known as the Krebs cycle. And we're going to keep it pretty basic here. But this yields a little bit of ATP. It is the next step, and it produces a lot of CO2 and water. The next step is the electron transport chain. This is still occurring in the mitochondria and is going to produce a great deal of ATP. What happens here are hydrogen atoms that were removed during glycolysis and the citric acid cycle are delivered to protein carriers. And these hydrogen atoms are then split into hydrogen ions and electrons in the mitochondria. The electrons give off energy in a whole bunch of complicated steps, but we're keeping it really simple, and it results in the production of lots of ATP. A nice summary of all three. We have the glycolysis occurring first out in the cytosol of the cell, where a glucose molecule is broken down to 2 pyruvic acids and 2 ATP. And then the pyruvic acids move into the mitochondria. We have the citric acid cycle occur first in the mitochondria, and it produces 2 ATP. And that's followed up by the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation, and this produces around 28 ATP. So we see that most ATP are produced inside the mitochondria. A small amount were produced at the beginning in the cytosol. Also, there's a great description of these listed below in steps 1, 2, and 3. I'm not going to read them out, but they're really, really great.